Welcome to Redacted Realms, where the shadows of history whisper their darkest truths. There are stories that do not die. They linger in the marrow of history, breathing through the cracks of time, stories so venomous, so exquisitely evil, that even their shadows were buried under stone in silence. Tonight, you will hear one of those stories, and when I finish, you will not be the same man you were 8 seconds ago. You think you know what evil looks like. The snarling face, the dripping fang, the open blade monsters you can see. But what if I told you that the most enduring evil is not fanged, it smiles? What if the darkest predator in human history wore silk gloves and prayed louder than saints? And what if the family everyone adored praised from pulpits and polished in the ink of newspapers was the architect of rituals so obscene they bent the very spine of morality? I'm talking about the Fairfax family, the name that history politely forgot, or rather erased, a dynasty of wealth and sanctity that draped its sins in the language of virtue. Men still quote their philanthropic speeches in dusty archives. Women still sigh over their elegance in faded portraits. But beneath those powdered wigs, beneath the sweet aroma of rosewater and scripture, something else lived, something diseased, something carnivorous. Salem, Massachusetts, 1811, a city aching to bury its own ghosts. The witch trials were a century behind them, yet the soil was still restless, still hungry. Reputation mattered more than salvation. Men clawed for respectability the way drowning men claw for air. And into that atmosphere ripe with hypocrisy came Victoria Fairfax. They called her a saint. They called her a visionary. They should have called her a weapon. She arrived like a storm wrapped in silk. Widowed at 32, draped in Virginia wealth, educated in Europe. Her voice was honey laced with iron. Her plan, to cleanse the sins of the poor through education. To open a sanctuary for orphan girls, those tender, fragile creatures with no fathers to guard them, no mothers to shield them, no power to question authority. She called it St. Mary's Academy for Young Ladies. The newspapers called it salvation. The church called it holy. The parents of Salem called it a gift from God. They were all wrong. What opened on that hill in September of 1811 was not a school. It was not a sanctuary. It was a machine beautiful, intricate, and engineered for only one purpose: to feed. Now, listen to me carefully, because after this moment, you can't go back. There are truths that cling to the mind like oil they never wash off. And the first truth is this: the Fairfax family did not build an academy to save young women. They built a stage where innocence was currency, where purity was bartered in whispers and blood, a stage upon which the most powerful men in New England came to feast not on food, not on wine, but on the breaking of something sacred. You doubt me? Good. Hold on to that doubt while you can, because I am about to take it from you, piece by piece. The first crack appeared in December 1812, a winter so brutal it split trees in the night like gunfire. That was when Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a seamstress too poor to be seen and too clever to ignore what she saw, heard the screams. They came from the chapel, muffled, gasping, cut short like a throat under water. She told herself it was a dream, fevered imagination. But when the sun came up, a child was dead. They buried her behind the academy in a grave so shallow the frost pushed her bones up in spring. And still, that was not the darkest part, because what happened inside those Georgian walls, behind the stained glass saints and the sweet smell of lavender oil, was not madness. It was not chaos. It was order, ritual, precision. It was the Fairfax doctrine, unwritten, unspeakable, but carved into the soul of every man who paid for entry to those third-floor rooms. You want to know what they did? No, not yet. Not here at the surface. To tell you now would be merciful, and mercy has no place where we are going. We will descend one layer at a time, like peeling flesh from bone. And when we reach the core, when you finally see what pulsed beneath the silk and scripture, you will understand why this story was locked away in lead-lined boxes. Why the state burned testimonies. Why the Fairfax name does not exist in the history you were taught. Because history lies. It lies with clean hands and cold eyes. It lies for the same reason Victoria Fairfax smiled while signing the death sentence of a 14-year-old girl. Power loves a good disguise. So let me take you back to the first night the academy opened, when the lamps burned like halos, and the gentlemen of Salem whispered prayers with lips that dripped with hunger. Back to the night Victoria raised her glass to God, while under her breath she toasted something older, darker, and infinitely more honest. Welcome to the house on Beacon Hill. Do you feel that? That tightening in your chest? That's the door. The one you were never meant to open, but you opened it, and now you belong to this story. Keep listening. The lamps along Beacon Hill hissed that night as if they knew. Gaslight always seemed alive in winter, trembling against the black void of December, and the air reeked of coal smoke and ambition. Every street in Salem was nailed shut with frost, but warmth pooled like honey inside the academy's drawing room. Velvet curtains drawn tight, fire licking the carved marble hearth, glasses sweating gold because where power gathers, winter does not dare to enter. Victoria stood at the center of it all, her back straight as a blade, her gown the color of spilled ink. She wore no mourning veil tonight. The widow's mask had served its purpose, and now, like all masks, it was discarded. The men who surrounded her, judges, merchants, ministers with voices as oily as their hair, could not stop watching her hands. They moved like music over the crystal stem of her glass, smooth, precise, conjuring the illusion that virtue itself had taken flesh. She was beauty sharpened into strategy, and she knew it. She spoke of grace and learning, of lifting the orphaned and the abandoned into God's light, her words slipping into their ears like narcotics. They nodded, they smiled, they blessed her vision. Men love a vision, especially when it flatters their own appetites. And appetite was the real guest of honor that night. The academy smelled of lilacs and lye, though behind that sweetness was another scent, a whisper of iron and salt, almost imperceptible, like the breath of something sleeping behind the walls. The girls had been sent to their rooms hours ago, dressed in white like lambs awaiting slaughter. They had knelt in prayer under the eyes of saints who had seen too much, their tiny voices rising like smoke to a God who had gone deaf centuries ago. Upstairs, the hallways murmured with giggles, the nervous music of young throats unaware that innocence is not a shield but a lure. And while they dreamed of ribbons and Sunday walks, the real sermon was being preached below in a language too old for the tongue and too heavy for the air. Victoria raised her glass, and the firelight caught the facets like captured suns. To salvation, she said, and they repeated it as if the word itself could bleach the blackness coiled in their bellies. Salvation, a word so sweet it rots the teeth. The toasts clanged like tiny executions. Then came the prayer, led by Reverend Harlan Pike, whose cheeks glistened with the fat of too many feasts. His voice shook the chandeliers as he called down blessings upon this holy endeavor. And oh, how heaven must have laughed, if heaven still bothers to watch, because while Harlan's lips offered hymns, his eyes wandered the staircase, imagining the tender shapes of those waiting above. Every syllable dripped like grease into the fire, and the flames crackled as if they understood. It began after midnight, as all obscenities do, when the lamps dimmed and the clock in the hall coughed out 12 hollow notes. The doors at the far end of the drawing room creaked open, and two men emerged, carrying what looked like an ordinary chest. It was not large nor ornate, but its weight bent their spines like sinners under penance. They set it down before Victoria, and the room seemed to exhale. Even the fire bent low, as if to see. She approached it slowly, the hem of her gown whispering secrets to the carpet, and when she knelt, the silk hissed like a serpent. Her fingers caressed the lid, then flicked the lock with the intimacy of long habit. The hinges moaned, and the smell that spilled out was not of wood or mothballs, but of time, thick, stale, and coppery, like something dredged from a grave too shallow to keep its dead. Inside lay the tools, not of learning, though that was the lie engraved on the academy's gates. No books, no slates, no chalk. These were instruments of a different education. Coils of ribbon, not for braiding hair but for binding wrists. Gags, soft as lullabies, perfumed to mask the taste of silence. Silver hooks gleamed like fangs in the firelight, their curves obscene in their elegance, and among them, resting like a crown upon velvet, was the mask, black as midnight and slick as oil. It bore no mouth, no eyes, only a slit for breath, because faces, Victoria knew, are dangerous. Faces remember, faces betray, but a mask is pure. A mask does not confess. One by one, the men approached. Their shoes whispered across the floor, and each bent low to kiss the edge of the chest, as if it were an altar and not a tomb. Victoria watched them with the serenity of a saint in a stained glass window, though inside, something darker than triumph curled like smoke. She had promised them a refuge from temptation, a sanctuary where the sins of the flesh could be transmuted into virtue through ritual. That was the genius of the Fairfax doctrine. It made vice holy. It wrapped perversion in the vestments of piety, so that even while they tasted corruption, they believed they were cleansing it. And belief, Victoria knew, was the sharpest blade of all. When the last kiss had dried upon the velvet, she closed the lid and locked it with a sound that snapped through the room like a bone. Then she spoke not loudly, for power does not need to shout. "Brothers," she said, and the word was a caress. "Tonight we build the first stone of our cathedral, not of marble or mortar, but of obedience. The world is chaos. Vice festers in the alleys. Lust breeds like vermin in the dark. Men of conscience must act not with whips, not with fire, but with the alchemy of sacrifice. These girls are not victims. They are offerings. They ascend through our hands, purified by pain, reborn into grace." Her voice was silk, but in that silk were threads of iron. No one breathed. The room was a graveyard, and she was the only living thing. Upstairs, a bell rang, soft, almost tender, like the chime of silver against glass. The sound slithered down the staircase, coiling through the room, and every head turned toward the shadowed doorway at the top. A figure appeared, small, slight, wrapped in white like a ghost. Her hair was the color of wheat in summer, her feet bare upon the polished wood. She came slowly, each step a whisper, and behind her, two more shapes bloomed from the dark, two more girls, their faces pale moons, their eyes wide with something they did not yet dare to name. They moved like sleepwalkers, like lambs led by dreams they could not wake from. The men watched, their throats working, their collars suddenly too tight, and in that silence, thick as clotting blood, Victoria smiled. Not the smile of a hostess, not the smile of a mother, the smile of a sculptor who sees the marble yield beneath her chisel. The rest you think you know. You do not. You imagine crude lust, a drunken frenzy of hands and teeth. No. The Fairfax doctrine had no patience for chaos. This was theater. This was liturgy. Every gesture measured, every breath choreographed. The girls were bathed, perfumed, dressed in linen that bore the seal of the Lamb. They were made to kneel, not before men, but before an ideal lie wrapped in scripture and sewn shut with silk. There were prayers, sung in Latin older than their grandfathers' graves. There were readings from books that no pulpit had ever kissed. And then, when the air was thick with incense and terror, when the fire guttered low and the shadows swelled like tumors, the masks descended. Black, featureless, merciless, faces vanished. Men became no one. And in that anonymity, the old world fell away. Do you want to know what happened next? Do you want me to paint it for you? Stroke by bloody stroke. No, you think you do, but you don't, because the human mind has a limit. And beyond that limit lies a darkness that does not wash out. I could tell you how the first girl's voice broke on the third syllable of the prayer. I could tell you what they carved into her skin before dawn, the words that still hum in the marrow of this earth. I could tell you how she looked when they carried her out through the servant's door, wrapped in canvas like a doll no one wanted to play with anymore. But I won't, not yet, because if I give you the heart now, you'll stop listening. And you need to listen. You need to understand that this was not an accident, not a frenzy, not a moment of madness. It was a beginning, a blueprint, a promise written in blood and sealed with silence. By the time the sun clawed its way over the horizon, the academy stood as still as a tomb. The men were gone, leaving only the echo of their breathing in the walls. Victoria walked the halls, alone, her skirts brushing against doors that hid what remained. Her hands smelled of roses, always roses. She paused at a window, watching the frost glitter like powdered glass on the hill. And for a moment, just a moment, her reflection seemed to smile back with two faces, hers, and something behind hers, something older than God. That was the first night, the first act in a play that would run for 2 decades and claim more than 40 lives. 40 girls whose names were scrubbed from ledgers, whose graves bloomed behind the academy like a secret garden. And no one spoke, not the parents, grateful for the charity that cloaked their shame, not the priests, who swore the seal of confession would damn them before it freed them, not the judges, who dined at Victoria's table and licked her words. Like honey from their fingers, silence was the mortar of the Fairfax empire, and it held firm for 20 years, until the night it cracked. But that is a story for another room, another key, another door you will wish you had never opened, never opened. The snow did not melt for 3 weeks. It lay over Salem like a burial shroud, muffling the streets, whitening the roofs, making the town look almost innocent from a distance. But inside the academy, innocence was already an extinct species. The windows leaked a jaundiced glow into the night, the chimneys vomiting black confession into the sky, and if you stood close enough, you could hear it, the hush of something breathing behind the walls. Not rats, though rats were plentiful. Something slower, heavier, something that exhaled in unison with the ticking of the long case clock in the vestibule. Time itself had become a predator in Fairfax Academy. Each hour devoured another secret, another scrap of flesh, and then moved on, hungry still. Victoria moved through it all with the serenity of a queen on Coronation Day. Her mourning silks were gone, replaced by gowns the color of storm clouds, and her jewelry now whispered of wealth that no widow should have amassed in such short years. But questions, like weeds, do not grow and wither not in a town where Victoria. Fairfax feeds the poor, funds the churches, and writes checks that smell of salvation. She hosted luncheons for clergymen who licked their spoons like altar boys tasting their first wine. And she offered scholarships to sons of judges who later bent their gavels to her will. Power, like arsenic, works best in small doses over time. And Victoria was a patient poisoner. The first girl's absence raised no alarm. An orphan from a family nobody claimed. A name written in ink that dissolved at the first drop of water. They said she had gone to Boston, that a cousin had called her home. They said it with smiles, their mouths blooming like rotten fruit. Because lies taste sweetest when everyone eats together. The remaining girls did not ask. Curiosity was not encouraged at Fairfax. Curiosity was a spark, and sparks become fires, and fires burn down cathedrals. So the girls stitched their samplers, practiced their hymns, and tried not to wonder why the door at the end of the North Hall was always locked, or why the new maid never spoke above a whisper. But some nights, when the wind prowled outside and the lamps guttered like dying eyes, they heard it. A sound that was not the house settling, not the rats. A sound like breath through cloth. A sound like something praying where no God could hear. The men returned in February. They came in carriages with curtains drawn, their boots crunching over the salted steps, their faces swaddled in scarves that smelled faintly of fear. They called themselves the custodians now, a name that fit like a glove sewn from human skin. Reverend Pike presided as usual, though his prayers had grown stranger, peppered with syllables no tongue was meant to hold. And Victoria had blossomed into something almost divine. She no longer knelt with the men, she stood above them. A black sun with gravity enough to bend their spines to breaking. It was she who unlocked the chest this time, her hands ungloved, her fingers pale as milk against the iron latch. Inside, the tools gleamed brighter, oiled and polished, as if they had been waiting like hounds for the hunt to begin again. 3 girls this time, not one, 3 lambs in linen, their cheeks pink from the slap of cold air, their lips trembling with rehearsed psalms. They had been chosen for their voices, Victoria said, because purity sings sweetest when it bleeds. The men believed her or perhaps they pretended to believe, because pretense is the final fig leaf over the nakedness of desire. The ritual was longer that night, richer, layered with chants that scraped the marrow of the air. The masks descended earlier, faces vanishing into void, and when the first scream spiraled up the stairwell, the snow outside seemed to shiver. What became of those 3? You will not read in any ledger. The ledgers tell other stories of generous donations, of improvements to the East Wing, of scholarships awarded to bright young scholars. The ink lies beautifully, But there are other records, not written in ink, records etched in bone, in scars, in the soil of the orchard behind the academy, where the earth grew soft from so much drinking. Those records hum at night if you press your ear to the ground. They hum of hymns warped into wails, of laughter sharpened into knives, of the day the doctrine was born in full. The doctrine was Victoria's masterpiece, her scripture without a god. It had tenets, though no one dared call them that aloud. Suffering is the ladder to grace. Innocence is an offering, not an ornament. Desire must dress itself in duty. These were the bones of it, wrapped in velvet and tied with a ribbon that smelled of sanctity. It spread like a sickness among the chosen men, with silver in their hair and rot in their hearts, men who signed their names in blood and smiled as they did it. They built an inner sanctum in the west wing, paneled in mahogany and lit by lamps that never seemed to go out. No servant entered without blindfold, no servant spoke afterward. Those who tried grew quiet quickly. The river behind Fairfax Academy swallowed secrets as easily as it swallowed rain by summer. The doctrine was no longer a whisper, but a wind, stirring curtains, rattling glass, bending lives like reeds. New men came, bankers from Boston, surgeons with fingers that longed for softer flesh, scholars who quoted scripture while their eyes crawled over small shoulders. They brought gifts, rare wine, foreign perfumes, books bound in skin so soft it might once have laughed, and always they left something behind: gold, influence, silence bought in heavy coins. Silence was the choicest currency. But even cathedrals of sin have cracks. The first was small, a hairline fracture in a mirror no one thought to look at twice. Her name was Clara Bell, though at Fairfax she was simply Clara, as if surnames were luxuries best left to those who would live long enough to use them. She was 15 and fragile as frost, with hair like ash and eyes that did not lower easily. Obedience sat ill on her shoulders. She asked questions in class, and worse, she remembered the answers. Victoria watched her with a curiosity that tasted almost like admiration. Almost, because admiration, in Victoria's world, was just another form of hunger. Clara heard things. She heard the bell at night when no lesson called. She heard the boards sigh underweight that did not walk like a servant. She heard whispers through keyholes, words she could not shape but felt in her bones like winter sickness. And Clara, unlike the others, did not swallow fear like medicine. She let it ferment. Fear, when left to brew, becomes something sharp, something that cuts both ways. The night she saw the masks, she stopped being a child. It was an accident, though accidents in stories like these are rarely accidents at all. A door left ajar, a draft that snuffed a lamp too soon. She was carrying a tray back from the drawing room when the sound came, low and rhythmic, like a hymn sung underwater. It lured her down the north hall, past portraits whose painted eyes seemed to twitch. The door was open just a finger's width, but that was enough to see the black curve of a mask glint in the firelight. Enough to see hands, not one pair, not two, but many, moving in unison over a shape that writhed like a broken prayer. Enough to hear the name of a god no catechism had ever spoken. She did not scream, not then. She swallowed the sound like poison, and it burned all the way down. From that night on, Clara did not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed listening to the academy breathe, counting the cracks in the ceiling until dawn bled through the drapes. She spoke little, ate less, and stared too long at things that were not there. But she remembered. Every detail carved itself into the soft wax of her mind. The masks, the murmurs, the glint of silver catching firelight. Memory became her rosary. Each beat a horror she fingered in the dark, and as memory hardened, so did resolve. Clara Bell was going to leave Fairfax, or burn it to the ground. If only it had been that simple. That simple. The fireflies came early that summer, flickering over the orchard like fallen stars. But Clara Bell no longer saw beauty in anything that moved. Beauty, she had learned, was bait, a glimmer to lure the naive toward teeth. Fairfax Academy glittered, brighter than ever. Its parlors were dressed in silks that rippled like still ponds. Its halls smelled of roses floating in crystal bowls. Victoria insisted on roses. Their perfume masked the iron tang that sometimes crept beneath doors, the dark spur of the doctrine's growing appetite. The men adored the roses, bending there, faces toward them like penitents toward relics, never suspecting or pretending not to that roots drink more than rain. Clara watched it all with a hunger colder than any winter. She had grown quieter, and in that quiet, sharper, like a blade honed under moonlight. The other girls shrank from her now. They sensed the fracture inside her, the shard of something too hard to touch. She did not speak in class unless forced, did not laugh in the garden, did not braid ribbons into her hair like the others. But she listened, always listening. Words were weapons here, and she meant to learn their edges. She listened to the maids gossiping in the scullery, to the porters, muttering as they hauled crates that seemed too heavy for what they claimed to hold. She listened at doors that breathed heat and incense, and every whisper stitched another piece into the tapestry of her dread. Victoria noticed. Of course she did. Nothing slipped past those eyes gray as rain on marble, eyes that had stared too long into fires and never blinked. Victoria knew the sound of dissent before it spoke, the taste of rebellion before it ripened. She had been watching Clara since the night of the accident, though she never called it that aloud. She saw it in the way the girl's hands shook when passing the salt, in the way her prayers stuttered like a carriage on broken cobblestone. Victoria admired the struggle. Fear was a kind of polish. It burnished the spirit until it shone with either submission or defiance. She needed to know which gleam this one would wear. So she summoned Clara one golden afternoon when the air lay heavy with besong, and roses sagged under their own red weight. The summons came on a silver tray, inked in Victoria's own hand, an honor no girl could refuse. Clara climbed the grand staircase like a condemned saint, her slippered feet whispering over the carpet's roses, her pulse drumming hymns that had lost their god. She was led to the solar, where sunlight slanted through amber glass and painted the floor with bars like a cage. Victoria waited by the window, a figure cut from stormlight, her gown the color of ink spilled on snow. She smiled when Clara entered, and the smile was soft as silk sliding over steel. "My little lark," she said, as if the words could coax song from a throat gone dry. "You've been so quiet, so still. I worry about stillness. It often hides deep waters." Clara curtsied, her knees trembling like leaves in a draught. "I've been unwell, ma'am." "Unwell?" Victoria's head tilted, a gesture, almost tender. "Illness thrives in shadow. We must let in the light." She reached for a glass decanter, poured amber liquid into 2 cups. The scent was sharp, spiced, unfamiliar. "Drink," she murmured, holding one out. Clara hesitated. For the smallest sliver of a second, she thought of refusing. But refusal was death here, swift, silent, and without burial. So she took the cup, its weight like a verdict in her palm, and drank. The liquid burned sweetly, coiling heat through her throat, blooming fire in her veins. Victoria watched her drink, and her smile deepened, as though some invisible scale had tipped. "Better," she said, her voice a thread of velvet. "Now, tell me, Clara, what do you dream?" The question struck like a bell. Clara's tongue thickened. Her breath slowed, and words rose unbidden, shimmering through the haze, spreading like ink in water. "I dream of leaving." The admission slipped out soft as prayer, and terror followed it like a shadow. Victoria did not flinch. She only reached forward, brushed a lock of ash-pale hair from Clara's damp brow. Her fingers were cool, as polished stone. "Ah," she whispered. "Birds were not made for cages, but even the freest wing must rest, must trust the hand that feeds." She leaned closer, so close Clara could taste the dark honey of her breath. "Would you trust me, little lark?" Clara tried to nod, but her head felt carved from marble. The room tilted, the sunlight bending into molten shapes, and then the world slid into velvet dark. When she woke, the light was gone. Only candle flames prowled the walls, and shadows crouched in corners like watching beasts. She was lying on a couch draped in something that smelled of roses and rot. Her gown was loosened, her skin slick with oil that gleamed where it caught the light. Hands had touched her too many to name. Voices floated from beyond a carved screen, men's voices, low and eager, braided with Victoria's silver tone. Clara closed her eyes and lay still, heart hammering like fists on a locked door. She did not move even when the voices drew near, even when the scent of iron swelled sharp as a scream. She thought, for one wild instant, that they would kill her then, She almost wished it. But death was a mercy the doctrine gave sparingly. Instead, they gave her something worse: survival. She was returned to her bed before dawn, her body aching, her mind a hive of fever and fractured images, masks bending close, mouths moving in liturgies that scalded the ear, a blade glimmering above a bowl dark with what might have been wine. She wept without sound until her tears dried to salt, and then she rose, dressed, and walked to breakfast like a ghost learning to wear its skin again. But something had changed. Not broken-tempered. Fear, hammered too long, becomes another thing entirely. Clara began to plan. Not in haste, not in fire, but in the slow, cold patience of winter. She smiled when spoken to, curtsied when required, stitched her samplers with bleeding fingers, and while she stitched, she thought. What she needed was proof. Not whispers, not dreams, but something solid enough to bear the weight of justice or vengeance. If justice proved too frail, the men were careful, but men are never careful enough. They left traces: a ring dropped behind a settee, a scrap of parchment curling in the grate, a stain too dark to be wine soaking the hem of a curtain. Clara gathered what she could, piece by poison piece, hiding them in the hollow of a bedpost, in the seam of a mattress, in the Bible no one but her ever opened. Each fragment was a spark. Someday they would make a fire. But Victoria was not idle. She sensed the shift, the brittle glitter in Clara's gaze, and though the thought of crushing such defiance thrilled her, it also pricked her with something. Colder curiosity, perhaps, or the ghost of something like pity. Victoria did not often wonder what she might have become, had the world been kinder. But when she looked at Clara, she almost remembered. Almost. And then the moment passed, and she tightened the noose with silk instead of rope. Autumn came, painting the orchard with bruised gold, and with it came the doctrine's grand convocation a night whispered of for months, wrapped in secrecy thick as fog. Carriages rolled in from Boston, from Providence, even from New York, their wheels hissing over wet leaves. Guests in masks of silver and jet drifted through Fairfax's halls like revenants at a feast. The air throbbed with music, not the innocent, strains of waltz or reel, but something older, heavier, pulsing like blood in the dark. Candles guttered in sconces carved with symbols no one dared name, and the great hall bloomed with roses black as midnight. Clara was summoned, of course. They dressed her in white this time, a color crueler than any gallows black. The gown clung like mist, its hem whispering over the floor as they led her down the stair. Faces turned, masks gleamed, hands clapped soft as moth wings. At the hall's heart stood Victoria, radiant in crimson, a chalice cradled in her pale hands. She raised it high, and the room fell still, silence trembling like a wire drawn taut. "My brethren," she intoned, her voice rippling through the air like a blade through silk. "Tonight, the circle closes. Tonight, the doctrine rises beyond shadow, beyond doubt. Tonight, we drink to eternity." And they drank, every last one of them, while Clara stood in the circle's center, her breath a shard of ice, her pulse a drumbeat of dread. She did not know what they meant to do, only that it would end her, or change her into something that wished for ending. But Clara Bell had come prepared. Sewn into the lining of her gown, stitched with fingers that bled in secret, was a thing, small enough to hide, sharp enough to kill. It nestled now against her ribs, warm with borrowed courage. She thought of the orchard graves, of the whispers in the dark, of the hand that brushed her hair back like a lover's before lowering her into hell. She thought of fire, thought of fire. The hall smelled of roses and ruin long after the last note of music bled into silence. The black candles guttered in their sconces, dripping wax like congealed tears, while masked faces leaned close over goblets veined with gold. Outside, the night howled against the windows, a restless wind clawing at the glass as though it, too, wanted in. But nothing out there could match the hunger in this room. Hunger had a throne here. Hunger wore crimson and smiled with a mouth that tasted of honey and ash. Clara stood in the circle, her breath fogging faintly in the chill that pooled along the marble floor. Her fingers brushed the hidden seam of her gown where steel slept like a coiled thought. The ritual had begun hours ago, chant braided with laughter. Laughter drowned in hymns that crawled like centipedes over her skin. She had knelt when they told her, risen when commanded. drunk what they pressed to her lips, though it burned like molten brass. Each swallow dragged her further from herself, until she wondered whether her name still fit her bones. And Victoria watched, always Victoria, her gaze steady as a blade laid flat against her wrist. When the chalice passed to her hands, when the hall fell hushed as snow, Victoria spoke Clara's name slow, savoring, as if unwrapping a secret. "Clara Bell," she murmured, and the syllables curled like smoke. "Come." The word drew her forward, though every muscle shrieked in mutiny. She moved through the throng like a moth staggering toward the flame, and when she reached the dais, Victoria's fingers found her chin, lifting her face until their eyes locked like jaws, up close. The beauty was unbearable to symmetrical, to polished like a statue that had learned to breathe. The candlelight lit the hollows of her cheeks, kissed the curve of her mouth, and Clara hated her so fiercely she nearly wept. "Drink," said Victoria, pressing the chalice into her trembling hands. The liquid within was thick, dark as spilled ink, sweet with the rot of something once living. Clara stared at it, and in its surface saw her own reflection warping, splitting, dissolving into shadow. She thought of steel whispering against silk, of red roses opening like wounds. She thought of freedom, sharp and bright as winter air. And then she drank. It scorched her throat, scalded her lungs, curled her belly into knots. The hall erupted in a soundless cheer, dozens of masks inclining, gloved hands lifting in some obscene benediction. Victoria kissed her brow, lips cool as snowmelt, and the circle closed around them like the jaws of a beast. Words poured over her, old words, heavy words, words that tasted of blood and brass. Her knees buckled, her vision swam, and the world pitched into darkness where voices tangled like weeds and hands dragged her down. Down until even thought drowned. When she woke, dawn had peeled the night from the windows, leaving the sky pale as a corpse's cheek. She lay in her own bed, though nothing about it felt hers anymore. Her gown was gone. Her skin was inked with faint red lines that spiraled and knotted in shapes. Her mind refused to name. Her body ached. Her lips were bruised, and deep inside her, something had shifted. A stone dropped into a still pond, rippling outward until every reflection shattered. She rose on unsteady legs, crossed to the mirror, and stared. The girl who gazed back was both stranger and self, eyes ringed with shadow, hair damp with sweat, mouth set in a line that might once have been gentle, but was now drawn tight as a bowstring. She touched the marks scrawled along her collarbone, and felt nausea climb her throat. They had written on her, claimed her, and yet she was not theirs. Not yet. From that morning on, the doctrine pressed closer, coiling like smoke through every hour. There were new lessons now held in rooms that smelled of iron and incense, taught by men whose smiles gleamed to white. They spoke of power as though it were a sacrament, of obedience as though it were air. Clara listened, nodded, even murmured assent when required, but behind her downcast eyes, thoughts seethed like hornets. She learned more than they guessed not. Their gospel, but their weaknesses. Who drank too much and let secrets slip like coins through loose fingers. Who feared scandal more than sin. Who could not resist the tilt of a girl's smile or the tremor of her voice in the dark. She wove it all into a snare of silk and silence, waiting. Victoria sensed the trap being spun. Though she did not yet see its shape, she only felt the pull. The tension strung between them like a wire that sang when plucked. It thrilled her, though it should have chilled her. For years she had broken girls like bread, bending them to her creed until their own names turned to dust on their tongues. But Clara did not break. Clara bent, yes, beautifully, like a reed in a storm, but always there was that core, that iron filament she could not sever. It gleamed at her from those gray eyes, and it maddened her, made her want to crush it, made her want to kiss it. And so she watched, and so she waited. Even as the doctrine fattened on its feast of innocence, new girls arrived each season. Meek lambs led through gilded gates, their laughter trembling like music boxes wound to tight. Some vanished after the winter balls, their names struck from the ledger, their trunks whisked away under moonlight. Others stayed, but change dyes dulled to pewter, smiles carved to deep, prayers mouthed without breath. Mothers wrote letters, fathers sent inquiries. All were answered with honeyed words, and when honey failed, with threats wrapped in velvet. None pried open the gates of Fairfax once they had closed. But beyond those gates, the world was stirring. Whispers seeped through cracks like gas of fortunes drained overnight, of daughters returned with shadows in their eyes and bruises blooming like violets. The press sniffed at the trail, though Victoria fed them morsels sweet enough to keep the wolves at bay. For now, yet even wolves grow bold when hunger gnaws their ribs, and hunger was coming not theirs, but the world's. Panic shivered through the markets, banks tottered. Men who once drank to the doctrine now clutched their purses with white-knuckled fists. The golden tide that had borne Victoria to her throne was ebbing, leaving mud and bones in its wake. Clara felt the shift like a tremor underfoot. Fear made men cruel, and cruelty made them careless. Doors left ajar, ledgers half-burned in grates. Letters crumpled, but not torn, each a thread for her to tug. And tug she did, slowly, silently, until her hands closed on something vast and venomous, proof, not of whispers, not of rumors, but of rot so deep it dripped from the roots of the doctrine like sap, names, dates, amounts that could topple empires. And beneath it all, the ledger. No, I was meant to read a record of rites that curdled the blood, inked in symbols older than scripture. She hid it well. God help her, though God had turned his face long ago, sewn into the lining of her traveling cloak, tucked inside the false bottom of a trunk meant for school books. For weeks she carried the weight of it like a second spine, bending her back but stiffening her resolve. She would leave. She would drag the doctrine into the light, if light could still cleanse what had steeped so long in shadow. And if she could not, if the world turned its gaze, as it so often did, then she would burn it herself. Watch Fairfax split like a rotten fruit and smile while the worms writhed in daylight. But Victoria was not blind. She read it in Clara's hands, how they trembled when no one watched, how they stilled when they should have trembled. She heard it in her prayers, spoken to smooth, to steady, like a song rehearsed for an audience that would never come. And she knew before the carriage was ordered, before the trunk was packed, before the last thread was knotted. One does not reign by leaving serpents in the cradle. The night before Clara meant to flee, Victoria came, not with guards, not with chains, but alone, draped in shadow and scent, her step soft as silk falling. She found Clara by the window, moonlight pouring over her like water over stone, silvering the anger carved into her face. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind rattled the panes like bones in a sack. Somewhere in the orchard, an owl moaned, low and long, a sound like mourning. "Goin' somewhere?" Victoria asked at last, her voice smooth as cream and twice as cold. Clara turned, slow as a blade unsheathed. "You know I am." A smile touched Victoria's mouth, brittle as frost. "And what will you do out there, little lark? Sing your truths to deaf men? Show them their own hunger and think they'll spit it out?" She stepped closer, the hem of her gown whispering over the rug. "They'll buy you, break you, bury you. The world is my reflection, Clara. You cannot smash the mirror without cutting your throat." Clara's hand slid to her cloak, feeling the crinkle of hidden papers, the pulse of her own heart drumming against silk. "Then let me bleed," she said, and her voice was iron. For a heartbeat, one wild, shattering heartbeat, Victoria almost yielded, almost let her go, to see whether the fire would spread or sputter in the rain. But hunger is a tyrant, and love, if this thing gnawing her ribs could be called love, was a crueler one. She reached, swift as a striking snake, and caught Clara's wrist. Steel flashed, brief as lightning, the little blade she had sewn into her sleeve. But Victoria was faster. Pain lanced Clara's arm. The knife clattered to the floor, ringing like a cracked bell. They grappled, breath ragged, skirts tangling like fighting serpents. Words tore loose, ragged, venomous, laced with something perilously close to grief. And when at last Victoria bore her down, pinning her to the carpet with hands that shook for the first time in years, she bent close, so close their tears mingled on the air. "I would have made you a queen, made you a queen." The snow came early that year, smothering the orchard under a shroud of white so pure it mocked the things buried beneath. Clara Bell watched it fall from her chamber window, the flakes spiraling slow as ash from some distant pyre, and thought, so this is how the world hides its sins beneath a veil soft enough to lull the dead. The academy lay silent under its mantle, But silence here was never innocence. It was breath held behind closed doors, the pause before the blade descends. 3 weeks had passed since the convocation bled itself into chaos, since the hall reeked of smoke and iron, and the doctrine tasted its own corruption like a serpent devouring its tail. 3 weeks since Clara ran through corridors slick with wine or blood or both, her hands raw with rope burn, her mouth scalded from the chalice forced to her lips. 3 weeks since she drove the blade home, and still she did not know if she had killed him or if men like him could be killed at all. The newspapers had called it a fire, a tragic accident sparked by an overturned lamp, flames leaping hungry through drapes fat with dust and oil. The guests, they said, had fled in panic. Several were unaccounted for. How dreadful, how strange, how quickly the embers cool when smothered in coin. No one printed the truth, that the fire began not in panic, but in ritual, that it licked first at the hems of robes, at the curls of parchment inscribed with names not meant for human throats. No one spoke of the singing, or the screams braided through it like black thread in a red loom. Clara bore her scars in silence. They bloomed beneath her gown where no eye could trace them. Burns, bruises, welts from hands that gripped hard in the dark. But worse were the wounds that left no mark, the memory of voices chanting her name as if it were a key, the feel of smoke clawing her lungs while laughter floated like music above the roar, and worst of all, the image of Victoria, standing calm in the inferno, her face aglow as if fire were her native light. Clara had thought the blaze would end it, thought the flames would eat the doctrine to its bones, leave nothing but ash and ruin. But the world is slow to burn when it is soaked in power, and power, Clara learned, is the most flammable thing of all. The academy still stood, scorched. Yes, the great hall a blackened husk. The east wing shuddered with boards, but its heart beat on. Pale and cold and relentless, girls still walked its corridors with eyes bright as coins. Masters still came in carriages swaddled with crests. And Victoria still ruled, her poise unshaken, her smile sharp as frost on glass. If the fire had scorched her, it did not show. She drifted through the ruins like a queen surveying a conquered field, her gowns trailing whispers over marble veined with soot. The girls whispered that she had lost something in the blaze papers, perhaps, or promises inked in blood, but if grief touched her, it wore a mask of radiance. She was more present than ever, holding suppers glittering with candlesticks and laughter, weaving her net with silk spun finer for its singeing. Yet Clara saw it in the shadow behind her eyes, the wound, small, but deep. The doctrine had not died, but it had faltered, and faltering breeds hunger. Clara moved carefully through these days, a ghost in satin shoes. She spoke when spoken to, recited her verses, stitched her samplers with the docility of a lamb. But inside, she was all teeth. She did not trust the quiet. Quiet was where traps hid their teeth. And so she listened, as she had always listened, catching the murmur of secrets slithering through the halls. The men had grown cautious, their visits rarer, their laughter clipped. There was talk of inquiries, of whispers curling through state parlors, of ledgers gone missing in the smoke. But deeper than fear ran resolve. The doctrine was not dead. It was burrowing like a serpent seeking warmer soil. One night, while the wind clawed at the shutters and snow hissed against the glass, Clara slipped from her bed and padded barefoot through the dormitory, her breath a plume in the dark. The air smelled of wax and frost, of something faintly sweet that made her throat ache. She followed it down the servants' stair, across a corridor ribbed with moonlight, and into the music room where no music played. The scent thickened there, syrupy and cloying, curling from a brazier that glowed like a coal heart on the floor. And around it knelt 3 figures cloaked in black, not girls, not maids, but women with hair unbound, their faces hidden by veils that shimmered like oil. Clara did not breathe. She watched as one lifted a silver bowl and poured its contents into the brazier. The flames leapt blue, flinging shadows that writhed like things alive. And in that light she glimpsed the face of the second woman as her veil slipped, Margaret. Hail, the language mistress, whose voice was honey over glass, whose hands had guided Clara's own in conjugations soft as prayer. Margaret's eyes were closed, her lips moving in a tongue older than Latin. and on her mouth gleamed a smile too bright for any god she had ever named. Clara fled. She did not run. Running drew notice, but she fled all the same, her pulse a war drum in her ears. She lay awake till dawn, staring at the frost that feathered her window, and knew the truth like a blade in her gut. The fire had not purged the rot. It had only burned the mask away. In the weeks that followed, the academy sickened with a fever no doctor could name. Girls grew pale and restless, their laughter brittle as spun sugar. To vanished sent home, Victoria said, for their health, though no letters came after. Strange men arrived by night and left before dawn, their boots trailing soot. And through it all, Victoria moved like a phantom crowned in flame, her beauty sharper, her smile deeper, her shadow longer. Clara knew she could not fight this thing with steel alone. Knives kill flesh, but what do they do to the soul? The doctrine was not ink on parchment, it was marrow and bone, fire and blood. If she cut off one head, 10 would bloom in its place. To kill it, she must strike at its heart. But where did such a heart beat in a vault, in a name, in the hollow between Victoria's ribs? She did not know, yet she hunted for the answer, as wolves hunt for winter meat, with teeth bared, with silence sharp enough to slice. It was during one of those hunts midwinter now, the orchard strangled and iced, that Clara found the key. She had gone to the library, a cavern of walnut and dust where the air tasted of secrets long steeped. She wandered the stacks until the hush thickened, until the lamps thinned to shadows, until she reached a door masked as shelving. It yielded to her touch like a thing long waiting. The room beyond was small, round as a well, its walls lined with cabinets latticed in brass. A globe crouched in the corner like a spider, its seas inked with poths that spiraled into nothing, and on a table, draped in black, lay a book bound in leather slick as old blood. Its cover bore no name, only a sigil that writhed when she stared too long. She opened it, and the stink of iron and smoke rose like a ghost from the page. What she read there, no, what read her would haunt her sleep till her bones were ash. Names, dates, deeds inked in a hand that curved like serpents in coils, maps pricked with pins, diagrams of bodies bound in circles not meant for angels. And at the center of it all, a phrase repeated like a hymn: the blood buys, the blood binds. Clara shut the book and pressed her fists to her mouth, choking on the silence, lest it shatter into screams. When at last she fled that room, the snow outside had thickened to a blizzard, and the wind howled like wolves unchained. That night she dreamed of fire, not the fire that had roared through the hall, but a deeper fire, one that burned without light, without heat, a fire that ate not wood nor flesh but time itself. And in that fire stood Victoria, her gown a river of ash, her eyes twin suns gone cold. Little lark, she whispered, though no lips moved, even embers can sing. Clara woke with blood on her tongue and frost on her lashes. She rose, dressed, and walked into a dawn raw as a wound, knowing what she must do. She would not flee. Flight was for sparrows, and sparrows break on the first wind. She would not beg. Mercy was a coin Victoria did not mint. No, she would carve her way to the heart. And if that heart wore a human face, then so be it. But even wolves may starve before they strike, and winter is long. Winter is long. The thaw came late that year, as if winter itself feared to loosen its grip on a world gone feral. Snow bled slowly into mud, and the orchard woke with blackened limbs, its blossoms strangled in frost. The academy stirred too, though what stirred within its walls was not life but something colder, harder, honed by hunger. The fire was a scar now, the east wing boarded like a coffin, yet the rot ran deeper than char and ash. Clara Belle felt it in the air, a pulse behind the silence, a rhythm like breath pressed against her ear in the dark. She had not slept well in weeks. Sleep was a corridor lined with doors she dared not open, yet they opened all the same, spilling dreams that clung like cobwebs when she woke. Dreams of the circle in the music room, of blue flames licking the veiled faces of women who smiled, with teeth too bright. Dreams of Victoria standing at the edge of a pit that had no bottom, her hands outstretched as if to offer Clara a crown or a knife. Sometimes the dreams ended in fire, sometimes in drowning, always in a voice soft as silk whispering her name. Clara rose early now, before the bell. Before the dormitory's hush broke into chatter, she walked the orchard while the mist clung low, her boots sinking in thawed earth that sucked like a mouth. She liked the orchard best in those hours bare, skeletal, stripped of lies. Each tree stood like a sentinel, black branches scribbled. Against a sky the color of old pewter, she could breathe there, or almost. But even the orchard was not empty. Sometimes she found footprints winding between the rose prints too large for any girl's shoe, leading nowhere, ending in churned earth as if the soil had swallowed them whole. The doctrine had changed since the fire. It no longer paraded in robes and rings, no longer feasted by candlelight while girls sang like caged larks. It had shed its old skin and grown another, subtler and slicker. The men came rarely now, and when they did, they came masked in philanthropy, benefactors, patrons, reformers speaking of progress with lips red from wine. The rituals, Clara guessed, had gone underground, deeper circles, darker fires. She felt them like tremors through the floorboards, vibrations in the marrow of her bones. Victoria moved through it all like a blade through silk, swift, sure, glinting cold. If the fire had singed her, the scorch only made her shine sharper. She hosted teas now, not banquets, lectures, not revels, but her hand lay heavier on the reins, her gaze keener, her smile curved like a sickle's edge. Clara studied her the way one studies storms, tracking every flicker, every hush of wine, because storms kill not by chance, but by design. She saw the first crack on a Tuesday in March, when the girls gathered in the salon for elocution. Victoria stood at the front, luminous as always, her voice smooth as cream, her hands slicing the air with grace enough to make murder look like art. And then a flicker, a falter so slight no one else marked it, but Clara did, the tremor in the glass. Victoria held, the pallor flashing beneath her rouge. It was gone in a blink, masked by laughter, but it lodged in Clara's mind like a thorn. Later, in the corridor, she found Margaret Hale waiting by the window, her smile sweet as sugared violets. Margaret had changed since that night in the music room. Her beauty was riper, her gaze heavier, her perfume thick as dusk. She spoke softly, of nothing at all, spring fashions, the latest poetry from London, but her eyes skimmed Clara like a blade testing flesh. Clara smiled back, demure as a lamb, and thought of the blue flames, the silver bowl, the tongue that curled like smoke. That night Clara wrote a letter she did not send. She wrote it in the dark, the nib scratching like a rat in the wainscot, the ink freezing on the page. She wrote to no one, or perhaps to the part of herself that still believed in dawn. If I do not leave now, I shall never leave at all. The words stared back like teeth. She burned the page before the ink dried. But fate or something fouler did not mean for her to leave. Not yet. It began with whispers, not the common gossip that braided through the dormitories like hair, but deeper murmurs that coiled in the dark, in the hush between bells. Girls waking to find their bedsheets streaked with soot, candles guttering blue though no draught stirred, a mirror spidered with cracks that no blow had made. Clara heard the whispers and felt them tighten round her throat, soft as silk, strong as chains. Then came the sickness. First in one girl, Alice Gray, pale as milk, with eyes too wide for her skull. She took to her bed with a fever that burned without sweat, her lips mouthing words no one knew. They said it was influenza. They said she would recover. She did not. They carried her out at dawn, and her pillow was black with hair. More followed. Not many, 3, perhaps 4, but enough to stain the air with fear. Victoria spoke of contagion, of precautions, of prayers. Her voice was balm, her hands cool, her poise unbroken. Yet Clara saw the shadow deepen in her eyes, the crack widen. Power phrase, when fear feeds. Clara waited, watched, listened. She gathered fragments like a magpie hoarding glass, scraps of speech, slivers of maps, a ribbon stained with something darker than wine. She pieced them in secret, her mind a loom weaving a pattern she dared not name. And slowly, dreadfully, the pattern bled through, a date circled in crimson on a calendar hidden behind ledgers, a phrase murmured in Latin that curled like smoke ad tenebris vocamus, and a name whispered once, only once, but with such weight it dragged the breath from her lungs. The equinox. It struck like a bell in her skull. The vernal equinox, the day the sun bends its knee to night, when balance tips, and thresholds thin. Clara knew then that the doctrine's heart still beat, and that it would bear itself in that hour. She did not know what shape it would take: feast, fire, blood, but she knew this: if she waited, if she did nothing, something worse than fire would come, something that would not stop with the academy. The days crawled like wounded things, each arrow wire drawn tight, humming with dread. Clara moved through them with her face a mask of calm, her hands steady as a saint's while her pulse battered her ribs. She smiled at Margaret in the halls, curtsied to Victoria with lashes, lowered, stitched her sampler in silks the color of bruises. And all the while she planned. She would need a weapon. Not a blade. Steel kills bodies. Not creeds, but something older, something that cuts deeper than bone. The book in the round room haunted her still. She felt its shadow in her sleep, heard its hiss behind her prayers. She had burned the scrap she tore from its page, but the words had scorched her mind. The blood buys, the blood binds. She did not know what blood they meant or whose, but she knew this. Power feeds on sacrifice, and perhaps, if she dared, it could choke on it too, on the eve of the equinox. Clara stole to the orchard. The trees stood black against a sky slit, with sickle moon, their roots knuckled like fists in the thawed earth. She carried nothing but a lamp and the knife she had hidden since that night, the blade that had tasted a man's breath as it fled his throat. She did not know what she meant to do, only that she could not do nothing. She almost turned back when she saw the lights, lanterns swinging between the trees, bobbing like willow wisps, their glow sick and green. Figures moved with them, robed, hooded, silent as moths. They wound through the orchard in a procession that shimmered like a serpent in moonlight, sliding toward the old chapel crouched at the far edge of the grounds. The chapel had been shuttered for years, its bell rusted, its pews rotting in dust, or so they said. Clara followed, barefoot now, the mud sucking her steps, the wind clawing her hair. She kept to the shadows, her breath shallow, her heart a drumbeat in her teeth. She watched them reach the chapel, watched the door gape like a wound, watched them slip inside one by one, their lanterns flaring as the dark swallowed them whole. She waited till the last robe vanished. Then she moved, across the frozen grass, through the broken gate, up the steps slick with moss. The door hung ajar, sighing in the wind. She pressed her palm to it, and the wood throbbed warm, as if blood ran behind it. Inside, the air burned, sweet and foul, thick with smoke that curled in coils. Candles seared the dark, hundreds of them, their flames bending as if to some unseen breath. The pews were gone. In their place sprawled a circle gouged into the stone, its grooves inlaid with something that gleamed like black glass. And around that circle knelt the robed figures, their hoods thrown back, their faces upturned in ecstasy or agony. Clara could not tell which. And at the circle's heart stood Victoria. She wore no gown now, only white, a white so pure it ached to see, and upon it bloomed stains like roses crushed underfoot. Her hair streamed loose, a river of fire down her back. In her hands she held a chalice wrought of bone and gold, and in the chalice something dark and thick that steamed as she raised it to her lips. Clara could not breathe. She could only watch as Victoria drank, as the circle flared red as a wound, as a sound rose, a sound that was not chant, not song, but something deeper, older, a hum that crawled beneath the skin like ants. The candles guttered black, then flamed again, taller, hungrier. The air shuddered, and the stone beneath Clara's feet seemed to sigh. She should have fled. She should have turned and run into the night, into the mud, into the teeth of wolves if need be. But she did not. She stepped forward, one step, then another, the knife cold in her fist, the lamp swinging like a pendulum of doom. Her shadow spilled long across the floor, and when Victoria's eyes found her, oh God, those eyes, Clara felt the world tilt, the world tilt. The sound was not sound but something older, something born before breath, of vibration that clawed at the roots of the teeth, that throbbed in the wet meat of the brain. It pressed against Clara's skull until the world blurred and bled, until the candles leapt like living things and shadows twisted on the walls, in shapes no scripture had named. Her breath hitched in her throat, shallow as a moth's wing beat, her fingers slick on the knife's hilt. Victoria moved as if the world belonged to her and always had. She turned from the chalice, her lips glistening dark, and the smile that split her face was not human, not holy. It was too wide, too sharp, a crescent moon drawn in blood. The congregation knelt prostrate now, their robes pooled like spilled ink, their hands clawing the stone as if to dig through to hell. The hum rolled from their throats, weaving through the chamber like roots threading earth, pulsing in time with the crimson blaze of the circle carved into the floor. "Clara Bell," Victoria said, and her voice was a caress and a cut, silk, soaked in venom. "Did you think you were hunter, child? Did you think you came with teeth?" Clara gripped the knife tighter. The lamplight swam, her vision warped. Victoria seemed taller now, stretched by shadow, her limbs long as branches stripped bare in winter, her hair a river of fire flowing into night. The chalice gleamed in her hand, and from its rim dripped something thick and dark, striking the stone in beads that sizzled like acid. The smell was copper and clove, salt and rot, sweet enough to make her retch. "You've come so far," Victoria murmured, circling the ring as if it were a lover. "Through fire, through blood, through every door you swore you'd never open, and still you wonder what waits beyond the last." Clara swallowed hard, her pulse a drumbeat in her skull. Her voice, when it came, was raw, ragged, but steady enough to cut the thick, thrumming dark. "What have you done?" Victoria's laughter spilled like honey, thick and golden and foul. "Done? Child, I am doing. We are doing. Tonight is not an end but an aperture, a hinge on which the world will turn." She stopped, sudden as a blade halting at the throat. Her eyes, oh God, her eyes caught the light and fractured it. Black shot with red like garnets sunk in pitch. "Do you know what balance is, little lark?" Clara said nothing. "It is a lie," Victoria whispered, stepping close, so close Clara felt the heat rising from her skin like fever. "Nature pretends at equilibrium, light and dark, life and death, the wheel and its spokes. But the wheel is rot, the spokes splintered. It must break before it remakes." Her breath brushed Clara's cheek, and it smelled of roses left too long in water, of sweetness spoiled and still tempting. "We are the hand that breaks it, the flame, the knife, the mouth, the knife." Clara's fingers curled tighter, her nails biting her palm. She thought of Alice Gray, hair black on the pillow. She thought of the blue flames licking the music room walls. She thought of the orchard, and the footprints that ended in earth. She thought of her own name, whispered in a voice like this, soft as silk and sharp as winter glass. "You killed them," Clara said, and her throat burned with it. "The girls, the men, the fire." Victoria tilted her head, smiling like a saint in stained glass. "Killed? No. Death is crude, a closing of doors. We opened them. We gave them passage. We made them infinite." The hum surged, louder now, thick as blood in the ear. The robed figures riffed, their voices braiding into one great cord of sound that looped the chamber and cinched it tight. The circle flared, veins of light running like molten metal through the carved sigils, and from its heart something swelled, something that was not smoke, not shadow, but both and neither, a shape coalescing from the crack between worlds. Clara staggered back, her lamp swinging wild arcs that sliced the dark. Her breath came in knives. She could not name what rose from the circle. Her mind skidded from it like oil from water. It was not beast nor man, not root nor wing, but pieces of all, writhing and folding and unfolding in silence that screamed. Its surface shimmered slick and wet, like flesh peeled from bone and dipped in stars. And as it rose, the heat rose too, thick and damp, until sweat slicked her skin and her lungs clawed for air. Victoria knelt then. The chalice lifted high, her arms bare and bloodless as marble. "Ad tenebris vocamus," she cried, and the others echoed, their voices breaking, weeping, worshipping. "Ad tenebris vocamus," the thing shuddered, and from its core spilled a sound like laughter drowned in thunder. The candles guttered, flames bowing low, and for a heartbeat the chamber was blind. In that dark, Clara felt the weight of eyes that were not eyes, the touch of thought that was not thought, slick and cold as something slithering through the meat of her mind. "Little lark," it whispered, not in sound, not in speech, but in marrow, in blood, in the black root of her soul. "Little lark, little knife, come." Clara screamed. She flung the lamp. It arched like a comet and shattered on the stones, fire blooming in a breath, racing in tongues across the floor, the robes caught first, the oil-fed blaze leaping from hem to hem. And the scent was hair, was wax, was flesh. The congregation shrieked, their chant breaking into 1,000 jagged shards of sound. Victoria turned slow, her face a mask of something almost tender. "Oh, Clara," she murmured, even as the fire curled up her gown, even as her hair wreathed in flame. "Do you think fire will close the door you opened?" Clara lunged. The knife flashed, bright as bone in the blaze, and struck home not in Victoria's breast, but in her throat, deep where the hum was born. Warmth burst over Clara's hand, a hot black rain that steamed on her skin, and Victoria's mouth opened in a soundless cry. Her eyes went wide, and in them Clara saw everything herself crowned in ash, the orchard in bloom and rot, the circle blazing on, and on top the world broke then. The stones split with a sound like mountains tearing, and from the fissure roared a light blacker than night, swallowing fire, swallowing flesh, swallowing screams. The thing at the circle's heart uncoiled, vast and endless, its limbs or roots, or wings lashing through air that boiled. Hands clawed for Clara, mouths sobbed her name. But the dark took them, took everything, until there was no chapel, no orchard, no sky, only a sea without shore, a silence that breathed, and in that silence a voice. "Little lark," it said, and the words were hunger, were promise, were home. "You have cut the cord. You have unlatched the gate. Now sing." Clara opened her mouth, and what poured out was not song, not scream, but something vast and black and burning, something that bent the dark like heat. She felt herself spill like water, like light, like blood. She felt herself stretch and split, unfolding into wings, into roots, into mouths that drank the night. She was falling, she was flying, she was drowning in fire that froze, and through it all the voice wove her name into its name, until there was no seam, no self, no end. When the flames died, when the smoke thinned, the orchard stood empty. The chapel was a husk, its stones split and charred, its bell melted to a tongue of slag. They found no bodies, only ash and a knife blackened to bone. The academy shuttered by autumn, the windows boarded, the gates chained, the gardens gone to thistle and thorn. But sometimes, in the first flush of spring, when the equinox tilts, and the dusk runs red, the orchard blooms all at once, blossoms pale as flesh, sweet as sin. And if you walk there then, if you stand very still, you may hear a voice rising from the roots, soft and low and bright as a blade. "Little lark, little knife, sing." This is the conclusion, the fall into something vaster and more terrible than fire, the cycle turning with Clara as both sacrifice and seed. It ties every thread, the doctrine, the ritual, the orchard, and the name that became the key, There was no sky, no ground, only a vast and living dusk that seemed to pulse with its own heart, a rhythm older than stone and blood, echoing through the hollow spaces where her bones had been. Clara drifted, or perhaps she strode, though there was nothing to stride upon, through an ocean that was neither sea nor air, an expanse black and burning where light bled like oil. Across the horizonless void, her body was no longer hers. It had unfurled, unspooled, stretched into something both infinite and narrow, both devouring and devoured. She could feel every drop of darkness like breath against her skin, every coil of sound slithering around her thoughts. And yet there was a core, small, bright, stubborn, that clung still to her name, to the knife that had slit Victoria's throat, to the heat of fire crawling up her wrists. But that core was fragile, and the voice pressed hard against it. "Sing, little lark," it murmured, tender as the hand of a mother, cruel as the claw of a beast. "The world is ash, and you are the rain. Pour yourself into me, pour me into you." She tried to answer, and felt her jaw unhinge wider than any human mouth, felt something peel away from her tongue like a strip of flesh. And when the sound came, it split the dark like lightning, a note so pure it hurt to hear. From the black ocean rose spires, bones of light, roots of shadow curling like fingers toward the unseen vault above. Shapes gathered on their ridges, shapes like birds and not birds, their wings fractured mirrors, their eyes deep as wells. They watched her as worshippers or as hunters, and their heads tilted in perfect, predatory rhythm. Clara stumbled or thought she did, and fragments of self scattered like glass in wind. Memories drifted past her, the orchard in late summer, the hum of bees heavy with nectar, Alice Gray spinning in the music room, skirts flaring like flames, Victoria's hand closing over hers, cool as marble and strong as iron. They floated, gleaming, and when she reached for them her fingers passed through as if through smoke. Panic surged, sharp and hot, and for a moment she felt small again, skin and bone and breath, heart hammering like a moth against a jar. No, she rasped or thought she did, for her voice was a current now, a thread pulled taut between worlds. I won't. The laughter came like a storm of locusts, a rattle of wings and teeth. Won't. The voice crooned, vast and velvet, brushing every nerve raw. You already have. The gate is open. The orchard blooms in bone. You are the root, the bloom, the fruit. You are the hymn the dark has hungered for. No, Clara whispered, clutching at the last splitter of herself. I'm Clara Bell. I'm the name tore her throat like wire. It burned, and yet it anchored, faint as a thread in floodwater. The shapes along the spires hissed, their wings beating in a sound like cracking glass, and the dark shivered, rippling outward in waves. Something stirred below, a pressure vast and slow, like a leviathan uncoiling in depths beyond depth. Its movement sang through her marrow, dragging her down, until she felt the last breath of air in her lungs vanish like smoke. Then came the garden. It bloomed sudden as a wound, unfurling in petals black as obsidian, leaves veined with fire. The spires bent like stalks, bowing beneath the weight of blossoms that dripped light thick as honey, sweet as rot. The air was a perfume of blood and myrrh, clinging to her skin like oil. At its heart rose a tree, vast and gnarled, its bark slick with something that pulsed like veins, its crown tangled with threads of darkness strung with stars like fruit. And from its roots ran a river red as a fresh slit throat, murmuring secrets in tongues that had never touched mortal air. The voice trembled through the garden like wind through reeds. This is yours, little lark. This is the root of roots, the bloom of all that withers. Eat and be whole. Clara sank to her knees, or perhaps the garden rose to meet her. The ground was warm, wet, breathing beneath her palms. Hunger gnawed her hollow, deeper than flesh, deeper than soul, a hunger that sang, that clawed, that promised an end to every ache she had ever known. Her gaze lifted to the fruit swinging from the black boughs. Globes of light shot through, with veins of crimson, dripping juice that smoked where it fell. She could smell it, copper and honey, salt and ash, and the scent unraveled her will like silk. She reached Dot, and then a voice, thin and brittle as a reed in wind, whispered her name. Not the name the dark had given, not the name that rang like a bell in the bones of the void, but her name, plain and human, trembling like a candle in storm. Clara Dot. She froze. The garden flickered, petals paling, fruit shriveling, the great tree splitting in a shriek of splinters. The voice came again, frayed but fierce, dragging her back through layers of silence, through walls of night. Clara, for God's sake, wake up. Her eyes tore open to fire. Smoke clawed her throat, bitter as burnt bone. The roof gaped above her, a mouth of jagged beams against a sky black with storm. Rain speared through in silver lances, hissing where they struck the flames. Hands gripped her shoulders, shaking hard enough to rattle her teeth. And through the roar of fire and wind came words, sharp and ragged. Clara, Clara, breathe. She gasped, choking on smoke and rain, and the world slammed backweight, heat, pain ripping through every nerve. She was on the chapel floor, or what was left of it, stones slick with water and blood. Figures moved in the hay shapes in uniform, shouting orders, hauling bodies from the wreckage. And above her, kneeling in ash, was a face she knew, a face she had thought burned away in the fire of that other place. Samuel Holt. His hair was plastered to his skull, his coat torn and blackened, his eyes wide and wild as a hunted thing. He gripped her hard, his hands smeared red, his breath sawing in and out. Jesus Christ, he rasped, dragging her upright, his voice breaking like glass. Thought we'd lost you. Thought. She stared, her lungs clawing for air, her ears full of the hum that would not die. Behind his shoulder, the world swam, flames licking the shattered walls, the orchard beyond writhing in wind. its blossoms torn and whirling like white fire. And beneath it all, deep as roots, she heard it, the voice, soft as rot, sweet as sin. Her mouth opened. Rain slicked her lips, smoke scalded her tongue. And for a heartbeat she thought the note would pour out, vast and black and endless, splitting the night. But Samuel shook her again, his voice a whip through the dark. Stay with me. Clara, for God's sake stay. And something in the sound rough, human, ragged as torn cloth snared her. She clung to it like a hook in flesh, like a root in flood. Her fingers fisted in his coat, her nails biting through the wet wool. And she forced the word through her raw throat like blood through a wound. I'm here. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. The hum was in her bones. The garden bloomed behind her eyes, and somewhere, beyond the reach of rain and fire and prayer, the gate still yawned wide. This is the first movement of the 9th section, about 1,300 words, bringing Clara back into the physical world while keeping the tether to the other side alive and pulsing. The tension is now dual, survival in the wreckage and the inexorable pull of what she touched. The hospital smelled of bleach and rain-soaked wool, of steel, and something faintly sweet, like lilies left too long in stagnant water. Clara woke to that scent, to the low hum of machines, and the pulse of light strabbing through half-closed blinds. It was day, though the light was pale, washed thin as milk, and the sky beyond the glass sagged heavy with storm. She lay very still, listening to the sound of her breath rasping through cracked lips, feeling the press of linen sheets against her skin. For a moment she thought hope that the fire had burned it all away, that the garden had withered, that the gate was closed. But then the hum came, soft as a thread drawn through her veins, vibrating against her ribs like a plucked string. And with it came the scent, not bleach, not lilies, but myrrh and iron, thick as blood on a warm stone floor. Her fingers curled against the sheets, nails biting the fabric. She turned her head and saw the flowers, white lilies, a spill of roses, pale as bone, their petals bruised by handling. They sat in a glass vase on the bedside table, heavy-headed and dripping beads of condensation onto the card propped against them. She stared at it for a long time before lifting her hand, the motion slow, her arm heavy as if waterlogged. The card bore a single line in a hand she knew too well. Stay strong. No name. No flourish. Just that. And yet she could see him, the slope of his shoulders in the rain, the ruin of his coat, the rawness in his voice as he dragged her from the ash. Samuel Holt. The last thread tethering her to the world she had once called real. She pressed the card to her lips, breathing in the faint scent of ink, and for a heartbeat she felt steady. Then the hum deepened, coiling low in her spine, and the walls of the room seemed to swell, their paint buckling like skin stretched too tight. The light faltered, flickering between gray and something blacker than shadow, and in that blackness, she saw them, the spires, the blossoms slick with fire, the river bleeding beneath roots that writhed like serpents. The garden had followed her. It was in her marrow now, in the spaces between her breath. The door opened. She jerked, shoving the card beneath the sheet as if it were contraband. A nurse entered, a woman with tired eyes and a smile fixed like a mask. She spoke words that drifted like ash, words about fever and healing and rest, but Clara heard none of them. She was staring at the woman's throat, at the pulse fluttering there like a trapped bird, and hunger ripped through her so sudden, so savage, that her teeth ached. Not hunger for food, not thirst for water, but a craving deeper, older, coiled in the root of her soul. She gripped the sheets until her nails tore fabric, until the craving dulled to a throb. When the nurse left, Clara pressed her forehead to her knees and bit down on a sob that tasted of blood. The days blurred, or perhaps they broke, sharp and splintered, for she could no longer tell where waking ended and dream began. Faces swam through the fog. Samuel's, gaunt with exhaustion, Dr. Pearson's, lined in gray, Alice Gray's, sweet and terrible, her mouth blooming petals that rotted as they fell. Voices murmured over her, voices too soft to follow, and beneath them all ran that hum, steady as a heartbeat, sweet as rot. She began to hear words in it, threads of language winding through the drone, bloom, rise, root, sing, and when the hum grew louder, the room changed, walls bowing like sails, windows stretching into arches of bone. the floor splitting to bare roots that twined slick as veins. She would blink, and the vision would break, leaving her curled on damp sheets, the taste of ash thick on her tongue. On the fourth night, though it might have been the 40th, she woke to rain drumming the glass, and the shape of a man slumped in the chair by her bed. Samuel. His head was bowed, his hands hanging limp between his knees, and sleep dragged hard at his face. She watched him in silence, drinking in the human weight of him, the smell of wet wool and tobacco. It steadied her, anchored her, even as something deep within whispered of the warmth in his blood, the sweetness of his marrow. She clenched her fists, nails carving crescents into her palms, until the whisper dulled. Then, softly, she spoke. His name. His head snapped up, eyes wild before they softened into something she could not bear to see. Clara. Her name broke on his tongue like glass. He was on his feet, at her side, his hands gripping hers with a desperation that hurt. You're here. Christ, you're really here. She wanted to tell him everything, that the gate had not closed, that the garden had rooted in her flesh, that every breath was a prayer to something vast and black, but the words withered on her tongue. What could he do? What could anyone? So she smiled, thin as paper, and whispered, I'm here. He stayed that night, and the next, and the next. Sometimes he spoke of the fire, of the search, of the bodies pulled from the ruins, but his words slid past her like water on glass. What mattered was his voice, low and human, and the warmth of his hand closing over hers. She clung to that warmth like a child clings to a candle in the dark, though the dark was always there, waiting just beyond the edge of sight. And then came the letter. It arrived with the morning light, slipped beneath her door by some hand unseen. No seal, no name, just an envelope the color of old bone. She broke it with trembling fingers, and the paper within smelled of myrrh and blood. The words were written in a script to fine, to sinuous, to belong to any mortal hand, and they burned. As she read, the root remembers, the bloom waits. You are the hymn and the blade. The gate is open. Little lark, come home. Her breath snagged. The hum roared, and the walls melted, and she was standing once more in the garden of black petals, the tree towering above her, its fruit bleeding light. Only this time, the shapes on the spires had faces, faces she knew, faces she loved. Alice. Gray, her smile a gash. Victoria, her throat a necklace of shadow. Samuel, his eyes blind and weeping. They reached for her, mouths opening in a chorus that split the dark. Sing. She screamed and woke to find her fist buried in the vase of lilies, water and shards spilling like blood across the floor. Samuel burst through the door, his voice sharp with terror, but she barely heard him. She was staring at her own reflection in the jagged glass, and what stared back was not her face. It was a mask of bone, its sockets burning with a light blacker than night. The night bled into morning without ever brightening, as though the sky itself had turned inward. Hollow and bruised, the storm that had gnawed at the horizon broke at last, flaying the earth with rain so cold it sounded like shattered glass against the hospital windows. Clara stood by that glass, barefoot, her gown damp where it clung to her spine. She had torn the bandages from her wrists in the dark hours, and now her skin throbbed beneath its constellation of welts. There was no pain, only a strange exhilaration, a fullness that swelled beneath her ribs until it pressed against her throat. It felt like song, like something vast and ancient writhing to be born from her lungs. She thought of opening her mouth and letting it out, but she knew if she did, the world would never be the same. Behind her, Samuel slept, or something close to it, slumped in the chair with his coat drawn over him like a shroud. His face in the weak light was hollow, carved by worry and sleeplessness, yet still human, still warm. She loved him for that warmth, loved him and hated him in equal measure, for he was an anchor in a world she was no longer tethered to. Every breath he drew sounded too loud, too fragile, as though the weight of her gaze alone might shatter him. She wondered what his marrow would taste like, if it would hum against her tongue the way the roots had hummed beneath her hands in the garden. The thought did not horrify her. That was what horrified her most. The letter lay on the floor where she had dropped it. Its words burned into the soft meat of her mind. The gate is open. Little lark, come home. And she could feel it now open, yawning wide like a mouth beneath the hospital, beneath the bones of the earth. The hum had grown into a throb, a pulse that shook the glass and rattled her teeth. She pressed her palms to the window, rain slicking the other side like sweat, and in its mirrored skin she saw not her own face but the garden, blooming black against a sky that screamed. The tree towered, its branches heavy with fruit that glistened like wet eyes, and at its roots lay bodies split like seeds, their mouths agape in hymns she almost remembered. The storm deepened, lightning cracking the world into fragments, and with each flash the hospital room shifted, one moment sterile and pale, the next a ruin crawling with vines slick as veins. The lilies were gone. In their place, a bowl of black blossoms breathed rot on the nightstand. Samuel stirred, murmuring her name, and the sound shivered through her like heat, like hunger. She turned from the glass, and the world tilted. For a moment she stood on the hospital tile, and then on soil soft as flesh, and then on nothing at all. Only the hum cradling her in its endless, mouthless song. "Clara?" Samuel's voice dragged her back like a hook. He was on his feet now, his coat falling to the floor, his eyes wide and wild. "Jesus, you're bleeding." She looked down, blood threaded from her palms, from the crescent wounds her own nails had carved. It dripped slow and dark, spattering the tile was at roots, in blooms that writhed as they spread. She smiled, a slow, broken thing, and said, "It doesn't matter." He crossed to her, hands outstretched, his breath sharp in the cold air. "It does. Christ, Clara, you've been through hell. Just sit, okay? Let me." But he stopped, because he saw her eyes. She felt it, the moment he froze, the moment his breath caught like a snare. And she knew what he saw there knew, because she had seen it in the glass, a darkness burning, black fire blooming where blue once was. His lips shaped her name again, but no sound came. And in that silence, the hum swelled into a roar. The walls, split they did not fall or shatter. They opened, peeling back like wet paper. And beyond them yawned the garden in all its ruinous glory. The sky was a wound, raw and weeping light the color of bone. The tree loomed vast as a god, its roots coiling through soil that steamed with blood. The spires stretched endless, and on them hung shapes too twisted to name, their faces hidden by blossoms that pulsed like living hearts. The air reeked of rot and sweetness, of iron and bloom. And at the center of it all, where the roots knotted thick as serpents, the gate burned a whole knot of fire, not of light, but of absence so. Deep it drank the breath from her lungs. Samuel stumbled back, his hand groping for hers. But she did not move. She was already stepping forward, her bare feet sinking into earth that squelched like fat. The gown clung, wet with blood and rain, and her hair whipped like a lash in the storm of petals. He shouted her name, shouted and followed, because, of course he did, because that was who he was, damn him. The sound of his voice frayed something in her chest, something fragile and human that fluttered like a dying bird. She wanted to turn, to tell him to run, to save himself, but the words burned away in the wind. The gate pulsed, the roots parted like lips, and from the dark within came whispers, sweet as poison. "Little lark, little blade, come home, sing." She felt the hum coil through her bones, winding tight, pulling her forward. Her heart stuttered against its rhythm, then broke into it, beating not for herself but for the thing that waited in the dark. And she knew, with a clarity colder than grief, that there was no going back. The garden was not a place. It was a hunger, a hymn, and it had chosen her as its mouth. Samuel caught her arm. His grip was iron, his breath ragged as torn cloth. "Don't," he gasped. "For God's sake, Clara, don't." She turned to him then, really turned, and for a heartbeat, the sight of his face, the ruin of love in his eyes, split her in two. She could taste what life would be if she stepped back, a cabin in some green place. His hand warm in hers, mornings thick with coffee and quiet laughter. She could taste it, and it was sweet, but behind it, vaster than stars, burned the other. Life, the only life now, a world flowering from ash, its roots singing in her blood. The choice was not hers. It had never been hers. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and the words came out like prayer, like ash on a wind too strong to hold. Then she opened her mouth and sang. The sound ripped the air like a blade, black and bright. All at once, a note that split the sky and shook the bones of the earth. Samuel staggered back, hands clamped over his ears, blood weeping between his fingers. The spires shuddered, the blossoms shrieked, and the gate yawned wider, vomiting petals and smoke. The hymn poured from her in torrents, each note a root driving deeper, each breath a bloom tearing through soil. And as she sang, her flesh unraveled not, falling, not rotting, but blossoming. Petals of bone and blood peeling from her frame until she stood bare and endless. Her body a crown of thorns, her hair a river of roots. She was no longer Clara. She was the hymn, the hunger, the garden made flesh. The world folded. The hospital vanished. The storm died. There was only the garden, black and burning. And she at its heart, her voice the axis of its song. The spires bowed. The roots writhed in ecstasy. The fruit split, spilling light thick as blood. And from that light crawled shapes older than language, their mouths blooming like flowers as they drank her song. And through it all, at the edge of the gate, knelt Samuel, his hands slick with blood, his eyes hollow pits that still, impossibly, clung to her as though she were something worth saving. "Clara," he mouthed, though the word was lost in the roar. "Please." She looked at him, and for a moment, one fragile, shattering moment, the hymn faltered. The thing inside her screamed, a sound like roots tearing stone, and she knew if she stopped now, if she let go, the garden would die, the gate would close, the hunger would sleep, but the price would be everything she had become, everything that had chosen her. It would be silence, it would be smallness, it would be the cage of flesh and time. She smiled, slow and terrible, and reached out not to pull him in, not to drag him down, but to touch his face one last time. Her fingers brushed his cheek, and for an instant, the world stilled. No hum, no roar, only the whisper of rain on glass, the scent of lilies rotting in a vase. For an instant, she was Clara again, and then the gate closed. It did not slam or shudder. It simply folded in on itself, swallowing light and root and blossom until there was nothing left but silence, no garden, no spires, no song, only an empty hospital room, its walls white and bare, its floor slick with water and blood. Samuel knelt on that floor, his hands empty, his face turned toward the window where rain wept against the glass, and in his lap lay the card, the one that had said "Stay strong." Its ink blurred to nothing. Outside, the storm broke, and morning bled pale across the sky.